By late 1944, Germany had run out of almost everything it needed to keep fighting: skilled workers, machine tools, raw materials, and most of all, soldiers. So it turned to the people who were left, teenagers and men in their 60s, pulled into a last-ditch militia called the Volkssturm. And to arm them, German industry rushed out one of the crudest, cheapest rifles ever mass-produced by a modern army. This is the story of the Volkssturmgewehr, a weapon built not for victory, but simply to put something, anything, into the hands of people who had never held a rifle before. Later in this video, we're going to look at exactly how little training the people carrying this rifle actually received before being sent to fight, and it's a genuinely uncomfortable number. But to understand how Germany ended up here, arming grandfathers and schoolboys with barely finished rifles, we need to go back to the moment the country ran out of soldiers. By the autumn of 1944, Germany's military situation had collapsed on almost every front simultaneously. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east, the Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and were pushing toward the German border, and years of brutal casualties had drained the pool of trained, able-bodied men available for the regular army. Hitler's response in September 1944 was to establish the Volkssturm, literally People's Storm, a national militia drawing on every remaining man between the ages of 16 and 60 who wasn't already serving in the regular armed forces. This wasn't an elite reserve force. It was, by design, a scraping of the bottom of the barrel, teenagers too young for regular conscription, older men well past typical military age, factory workers, and men previously exempted from service for health reasons or occupational necessity.
The problem this immediately created was straightforward and severe.
Germany suddenly had a few million additional bodies it wanted armed, and nowhere near enough standard rifles, factories, or skilled labor to produce them through conventional manufacturing methods. Existing rifle designs like the Karabiner 98K required precision machining, seasoned wood stocks, and skilled gunsmiths, exactly the kind of resources Germany no longer had in any meaningful supply. The answer German industry landed on was a genuinely radical rethink of what a rifle even needed to be. Instead of asking, how do we build a good rifle, the actual engineering question became, how do we build the absolute minimum functional rifle possible using materials and labor we can actually still access? The result, broadly known as the Volkssturmgewehr, though several distinct variants existed, most notably the VG-1-5 and VG-45, stripped rifle manufacturing down to its bare essentials.
Barrels were often simplified or repurposed from other weapon stockpiles. Stocks, instead of precision-shaped wood, were sometimes crude, roughly cut wood, or even basic sheet metal stampings. Many components that would normally be machined from solid steel were instead stamped from sheet metal, a much faster and cheaper production method that required far less skilled labor and far less precision machinery. Some variants used simple straight-pull bolt actions instead of the more complex rotating bolt mechanisms found in standard-issue rifles, specifically because straight-pull designs could be manufactured with fewer precisely machined parts. Every design decision came back to the same underlying question. Can this be built quickly, cheaply, and by workers with minimal training, using whatever materials happen to still be available? The result was, by any normal standard, a genuinely rough weapon. Fit and finish were poor. Many examples had visible weld seams, rough, unfinished metal surfaces, and noticeably inconsistent quality between individual rifles, since production was often spread across multiple smaller manufacturers rather than centralized in Germany's usual major arms factories, many of which had already been destroyed or disrupted by Allied bombing. Some variants were criticized even at the time for reliability issues. Reports described certain models being prone to jamming or, in rarer, more troubling cases,
Some sources suggest issues with rounds occasionally detonating out of battery, a serious safety hazard for the person holding the weapon. Reliability testing that would normally happen over months or years of a weapon's development cycle was compressed into a fraction of that time because there simply wasn't time left to spare. This wasn't a case of German engineers being incompetent. The same country was still producing the excellent STG-44 assault rifle and other sophisticated weapons during this same period. It was a case of a nation making a deliberate trade-off. A large quantity of barely adequate rifles right now distributed to people who needed something, anything to hold, rather than a smaller number of properly finished, thoroughly tested rifles that wouldn't be ready in time to matter. Here's where we come back to that number from the teaser. Volkssturm conscripts, in many documented cases, received startlingly little training before being sent to defend towns and cities. In some accounts, as little as a few days, sometimes barely any formal instruction at all, beyond a basic explanation of how to load and fire the weapon they'd just been handed.
Picture a 60-year-old former shopkeeper, or a 16-year-old who a year earlier had been in school, being issued a crudely stamped rifle they'd never fired before, given minimal instruction, and sent to help defend a barricade or a street corner against advancing Soviet or Allied forces that, by this point in the war, were often experienced, well-equipped regular army units. This mismatch between the weapon, the training, and the enemy being faced is really the emotional core of this whole story. The Volkssturmgewehr wasn't primarily a failure of engineering. Within its absurdly compressed design constraints, it mostly did what it was built to do: fire bullets. The deeper tragedy was the situation it represented. A country so depleted that it was arming its oldest and youngest citizens with rifles built in weeks and sending them into combat against professional soldiers with a fraction of the preparation any of them actually needed to survive. A few facts worth knowing. There wasn't really one single Volkssturmgewehr. The name covers a range of distinct, often incompatible designs from different manufacturers, built to slightly different specifications depending on what materials and machinery a given factory happened to have on hand. Unlike most standard-issue military rifles, there was no single unified blueprint, just a shared philosophy of build something fast with what you've got. Some variants couldn't even reliably eject spent casings without manual help. Certain simplified designs required the user to manually assist with extraction or loading in ways more sophisticated rifles handled automatically. A small but telling example of just how far basic function had been stripped back in the name of speed and cost. Ammunition compatibility was sometimes a genuine gamble.
Because some models used simplified or improvised barrel and chamber specifications, not every batch of standard ammunition necessarily functioned perfectly in every rifle. A serious problem for a weapon meant to be handed to inexperienced users under combat pressure, with little time or expertise available to diagnose why a rifle wasn't feeding properly. A number of these rifles survive today specifically because so few were actually used in prolonged combat. Because the war ended so soon after most Volkssturmgewehr variants reached the field, a comparatively higher number survived intact compared to rifles that saw years of hard combat use, meaning some of the roughest, most rushed rifles Germany ever produced are, ironically, better preserved today than some of its more refined wartime weapons. It's tempting to judge the Volkssturmgewehr purely as bad engineering, but that framing somewhat misses the point.
Given the actual constraints Germany was operating under in late 1944 and early 1945, collapsing industrial capacity, a desperate shortage of trained workers, and a leadership determined to keep fighting regardless of the human cost, a crude, fast, cheap rifle was, in a narrow technical sense, a rational response to an impossible situation. The real ethical and strategic failure sits one level above the weapon itself.
The decision to keep the war going at all, to the point of arming children and elderly civilians with rushed weapons and minimal training, rather than acknowledging the war was already lost. The rifle did what a rifle built under those conditions could reasonably be expected to do. The situation that required its existence in the first place is the part of this story that's genuinely difficult to look at objectively.
The Volkssturmgewehr isn't a weapon people remember for being clever, or revolutionary, or ahead of its time, the way some of the other equipment on this channel has been. It's remembered, when it's remembered at all, as a symptom, a physical object that captures exactly how far Germany had fallen by the final months of the war, reduced to handing barely finished rifles to people who, a year earlier, had no business anywhere near a battlefield. Sometimes the most revealing weapon in a country's arsenal isn't its most powerful one. It's the one built when there was nothing left to build with, and nobody left to send, but the people who should never have been there in the first place. If you want to see the other end of this story, one of the genuinely advanced weapons Germany built, even as everything else was falling apart, let me know in the comments.